G'day everyone, my name's Chris and this is Let's Walk. In April 19 years ago, in 2006, our then Treasurer, Peter Costello, came out and declared a day of National Debt-Free Day. And basically what he was saying is that Australia had paid down all its net debt. We still had some gross debt, but our net debt had been paid down, and they'd paid down in that previous 3 years that they'd been in term about $96 billion worth of debt. And some of that was through sell-offs, the sell-off of Telstra. I think about $50 billion of it was through sell-offs. The balance, about half, was through responsible budgeting and taxation changes. What it did is put Australia in a really, really strong position heading into the 2000s, or 2010, toward 2010, where we'd be able to be in a position where we were pretty much debt-free and we could make choices that perhaps a lot of nations can't. Here we are 19 years later and we're about to trip over $1 trillion worth of debt. And it's growing at a rate of around $60 billion a year. Now, you can argue about the $1 trillion worth of debt, that's gross debt. You can argue about whether we owe it to ourselves. I think about 50% of our debt is actually held by the Reserve Bank of Australia. So we're actually paying ourselves interest to pay our own debt down. So is it true debt? Probably not. We could probably write that off and we'd only have $500 billion worth of debt. But debt is debt. So this year our debt of $1 trillion will equate to around 36% of GDP. And the landscape for our GDP as a nation has changed dramatically over the last 20 odd years. We've gone from agriculture and manufacturing, mining, to a really strong service-based nation, a little like the US has, and they're now trying to reform. Depending on the reports you read, it puts the services component of our GDP at around 80%. I've read other reports that it's closer to 60, but let's go with the 80. Our mining, for all it's worth, only makes up about 5%, which really surprised me. So there's a couple of things that have worried me. We're into a federal election now, and neither of the larger parties, be it the incumbents or the challengers, have spoken about writing the debt down or reducing the debt during their campaigns. And the campaign's only a week old, but neither of these parties seem at all interested in reducing the nation's debt. They're far more interested in making promises. I mean, one of the parties has said they're going to reduce energy bills by $150 a year. I mean, come on, take that $150 a year and put it toward the debt. Wouldn't we all prefer that? Because really, at the end of the day, 70, 80 cents, whatever it works out to be a day, isn't really going to help anybody. At the end of the week, it might get you a coffee. That's about it. We don't need coffee. What we need is a nation that's strong and doesn't have debt and can therefore focus on the things that are important, like growing employment and reducing taxation and helping the people to pay their own debt down. So it makes me wonder about what it is that these governments are trying to achieve. And really, in Australia, all they're trying to achieve is to win the vote. And once they've won the vote, once they're in power, they forget about that for another 3 or 3.5 years before they go again at another election. I don't think either of our major parties really give a hoot about paying the debt down and getting Australia back to a position where it's strong. Now, our economy's reasonably strong if you compare us to other first world economies like Japan. Their GDP, debt to GDP is about 250%. So that's far worse than ours. The US is much higher. They're going toward $30 trillion worth of debt with a population of about 10 times what Australia is. So, and a debt level of about 30 times what Australia is. And you say what you like about Donald Trump, but reform is reform. And whether he pisses everybody else in the world off by doing it, if you want to believe in the good in everybody, then what he's trying to do is change the model so that the US aren't just continuing the massive debt hole that they find themselves in and growing that debt every year. I really wish there was a party in Australia that would focus on the same thing. As the average Joe Blow in the street, we want to pay our debt down. We don't want to be in debt. Our first priority is to pay the mortgage off, or pay the car loan off, or pay the credit card off, or whatever debt you have. That's always the first priority. The first thing you do is pay your rent or your mortgage or your credit card, or, and then you've got your, whatever's left after that is disposable, and then you can make your decisions. The Australian government makes all those other decisions, like, $250,000 of travel per minister internationally. And then at the end of the year, they seem to think it's okay for us to have a deficit. We might budget for a $30 billion deficit, and that deficit might end up being $60 billion. And it's never the government's fault that has blown out of control. It's always something happened. We didn't get as much tax as we thought on minerals, or we didn't get, we had a pandemic, or we had a cyclone, or something flooded, or a bushfire went through. But these are things that you've got to allow for, and we don't as a nation. And I personally am really worried about the future that we're going to hand over to our children, and I'm going to cover that off in a separate topic. But at this stage, what it looks like we're going to do is hand over a debt-laden nation to our kids, and it'll be my generation that has done that, which makes me feel bad. Only 19 years ago that we were net debt-free. Now we've got net debt of around, I think it's around $600 billion, $650 billion, something like that. The interest alone takes up a huge chunk of our budget. It's well and truly into the 20 billions, just in interest. Imagine what you could do with that $20 billion if you didn't have to spend it on interest, even though half that interest is going back into our own coffers. The incumbent government has, in the last 3.5 years since it's been in term, employed 41,000 bureaucrats or government jobs at the cost of around $6 to $7 billion a year. And I ask Australians, where do you reckon that $7 billion or those 41,000 people are working? What have they done to help cost of living or services? Have you seen your roads improve? I mean, I live in a state where I don't think there's been any roadworks done to repair roads for a long time. There's tunnels being built and etc., but doesn't seem to be potholes being filled in anywhere. So, I ask myself again, what are these governments doing to control the outrageous spending that seems to be going on in our nation? And I'm not talking in our state. That state's a whole separate issue. But in the nation itself, we're just spending and spending and spending. And I think it's time for either the incumbent or the challenging party to stand up and say, we're no longer interested in spend. What we're going to do is save. Just like the rest of us are expected to save. If we don't have enough money to buy the milk and bread today, we don't buy the milk and bread. It's just started raining, guys, so sorry about that. The weather's turned. We've got our first week of autumn. See if I can get under a tree to continue this. So if it's good enough for the government to spend willy-nilly and it's not good enough for the people, then there's a imbalance. And that imbalance is super annoying to me. So I don't know how everybody else feels. I just thought I'd do a short video on that today. What's the answer? Well, the challenging government at the moment is talking about reducing the fuel excise by 50% for 12 months. Maybe they should have reduced it by 25%, and the other 25% goes to paying down debt. Take 25% of that in, that excise, and put it toward debt. There's got to be a way that we can reduce debt without increasing taxes. Anyway, if you've got any ideas, please comment. Please let me know. But it would be fantastic for either the incumbent or the challenging parties to come out and let us know how they're going to get our massive debt under control. Good on you guys. I'll see you on another walk.